Welcome to the Tech Talks podcast. Today I'm joined by Coach Jarod Burton. Jarod, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing awesome, man. Thank you for making the time to come on here. Why don't you just start us off with telling everyone where you're from, where you're working now, kind of how you got to where you're at, and just a little bit of background about you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Southwest Michigan, and from there developed pretty much a love for baseball. I played it my whole life. Made the choice at a very young age to actually specialize in it. You know, they say don't specialize in one sport. But I was, as every little kid's like, I'm going to play this sport. I'm going to make it to the big leagues, and this is what I'm going to do. And so played baseball all through high school, went to college, played in college. And then while I was in college, I would say that's probably when I started getting more interested into the actual training, knowing myself, battling with injuries, honestly not being able to move well, not really much of an athlete. It's very easy, like for myself, I was put in the category where it's like, hey, this is the, he's more of a designated hitter. He's a lefty hitter. Like, yep, he can hit bombs, but he can't run. He can't move. And I always had honestly like an issue with that. The fact that I was like, why can I do it? But then, at the same time, you just kind of accept it. But I was more like interested in the training, whatnot. That's also too where I met Brady Volmering, which we'll talk about. He's the guy that I went on the trip with around the country. And essentially he really sparked my interest and my curiosity towards the strength and conditioning field and what it had to offer, and just how that could benefit someone as a player, and how, like, can I take myself, who I see myself as this category of like not an athlete, not a mover, and can I turn myself into that person? So, we kind of went on a conquest to really just learn and be very open. And so that's kind of my background now. Oh, I guess now I guess I should say this. I was out of college. Brady and I went to Springfield, Missouri, and we worked at a baseball facility there. We were hired on there. So Brady handled like the hitting and kind of did some stuff with the throwing. And then I was like in the weight room, taking control of that. And then after, COVID hit and everything, and everything went on pause, I applied to chiropractic school, and we can talk about this later too, with the intention of not getting accepted in. Mm-hmm. So I hate school. I don't like it. I promised myself I would never go back. And so I applied like a month before before the semester or the trimester was supposed to start. And then I got back like a phone call like the next day, and they're like, you're accepted. And I was like, shit, I guess I'm going. So now I'm at chiropractic school in St. Louis, and that's the most recent.
That's awesome. So you kind of mentioned it there, and I heard you talk about it on a different podcast, but I'd love to hear more because, one, I'm super jealous, and two, I think it's just a cool story. So do you want to tell us a bit about that road trip that you went on, some of the guys you visited, what your motivations for taking on an endeavor like that were?
Yeah, absolutely. So it really started with Brady. He would be sending me some context. We were both working at a landscaping company, and he was put out for whatever reason out in a tree farm for the majority of the time. So he literally just for 12 hours probably about 10 hours a day, he was just pounding stakes into the ground, nurturing little baby trees, pruning them, whatever, he needed to do. And he'd be listening to podcasts all day. And he'd send me a podcast if it was good or whatnot. And one day he just texted me. He's like, hey, what if instead of just listening to all these people speak, we just go and visit them and we learn? And so I was like, yeah, let's do it. Because I'm a pretty adventurous person myself. I love to travel. So we basically took all the money that we made, and instead of saving it, we used it all towards the trip. So we loaded up in just a small little car. We lived off of PB&Js pretty much the most of the time. It's just, we're on a budget. So, but essentially what we wanted to do is, since we live in Michigan, we wanted to start in Michigan. We want to go all the way out to the West Coast, down the West Coast, shoot back all the way over to the East Coast, work up that way, and then return back. And so our very first visit was to the University of Minnesota to visit Cal Dietz. And right from the get-go. That was definitely one of my favorite visits. Just being, I was always very used to, you know, the ladders and like stride length plus stride frequency equals speed. And, you know, if you can increase the frequency of your feet, you know, on the speed ladder or whatever, and then if you spread hurdles out super far, then you're going to increase your frequency and put those two together and that equals speed. And so that's where my mindset was coming from. And then visiting Cal and just realizing how advanced he was, just above everyone else. And Brady before that had a better understanding. He read triphasic training before I did. So I ended up, after we met with Cal, I ended up reading, let me get some water. I ended up reading some triphasic training as we were traveling, which is kind of funny, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second.
And like, yeah, Cal's an absolute like dark wizard in the strength and conditioning world. Like,
yeah, so
he does things a little different, and he obviously gets great results with what he does.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest things that influenced me today in exploring, because he was the first person that really looked at it and was like, okay, whatever like somebody says, I'm gonna go test it. And I don't know if you know anything about Cal, but you know, there's always this rumor, and I mean, it is true, but like he has this secret room to say back in his laboratory, I guess you could say, with all these fancy training equipment and kind of research tools. So like whatever he's doing with his athletes, like he's constantly researching, is constantly updating. You know, the things that we went and saw him do at that time, everything was oscillatories with the bands.
Yep.
And so banded assisted jumps, the flutter kicks in between the bands. And so he was doing all that stuff. And I had an interest in research, like sports research, because that's what I almost went and got my master's in. So I asked him, you know, would you ever like publish this stuff or do studies on it? And I mean, if you're a strength coach and you don't have time, you know, studies are, I mean, even for myself this isn't something I mentioned, but I've conducted 2 research studies as well. And I did that my senior year in college. So that's why I love research. But essentially he told me, is like, everything that we do, you got to test it. And like, there's no time, you know, you gotta observe it and then move on. And then you just got to wait 10 years for everybody else to catch up. But, you know, he's not in the game to wait for everything to kind of meet up to him to say. So that was an awesome experience. That was the biggest thing I took away from it, just test everything. And then after that, we went out to Washington and visited a baseball facility. And to be honest, our trip after visiting Cal was actually very difficult. We actually even pondered the idea of stopping our trip, just because of how different at that time Cal's mindset was towards everybody else. Like even at that time, like just for an example, going into training for like competitive sport versus just like training for the weight room. And at that time, it was the big concept. Like that's when RPR started getting big, reflexive performance reset, for athletes that don't know that. Essentially, you target neural lymphatic system, and then it wakes up certain muscles that might be not as reflexively firing as fast as they could be.
Yeah.
And so with it too, and that was also too where the time when he was talking about like bracing the core, not bracing a core, like should we be bracing core? Should we be trying to be stabilizing? So there's a lot of this controversy that he was just adjusting. And a lot of the places that we went to out the West Coast were more of that old model, like getting into a plank and like trying to challenge core, you know, stability and these kind of aspects. And so there wasn't really much that we learned on the West Coast. And then we ended up going to a place in Arizona, and this guy's name is Brandon Harris, a really down-to-earth guy. It's Premier Fitness Systems. And one of the biggest things that I took away from him was just his emphasis on breath. And so, you know, if you go look on his training, it's really nothing of any training that I do. But I think one of the best, one of the things that he does the best, and one of the biggest things I took away is just his focus on breath work. And essentially, like, that's where I got my concept of, you know, I'm always trying to challenge and put as much stress on an athlete. And so like, I'm always trying to figure out areas that they can't breathe. And then if they can't breathe in that position, that's obviously a problem. And so just exposing an athlete in that, putting them in a position they can't breathe in, and then teaching them to breathe. Now, he doesn't do it to the extent that I do it. It's more of just like getting in more basic positions, just more
Like
foundational
a
positions.
box breathing drill or something like that, something a little more
Sure, box
rudimentary.
breathing on your back, any sort of movement. So like making sure that your breath drives your movement. It was really like his kind of focus. So that was really good. I enjoyed that a lot. And then after that, probably just for the experience, maybe this is for experiential wise, I guess this would probably be my favorite, but we ended up at Westside Barbell. And that was awesome. Being able to spend 2 days with Louis was just a treat. I mean, we showed up and, you know, you got these people with they were just walking sleds around the building. You know, we don't know what's going on. Brady and I walk in and, you know, the culture's going crazy. They're all screaming and yelling at each other. You have all these people trying to PR on deadlift, and we're like, what do we do? And then, you know, one of the guys turns to us and was like, what are you doing standing around? Like, go get a lift. Like, and so then we had to like go around and we started deadlifting over in this like random corner. And then, like after an hour went by or something like that, and we're still like lifting and they get done, one of these guys comes over and he's like, you know, what sport do you play? And we're like, baseball. He's like, oh, great. Come over here. And the next thing you know, we're working out for the next 2 hours. No idea what's going on. We're both gassed. And we get done and we're just drenched in sweat. I know Brady's like feeling like he's going to puke. And he's like, yeah, that's our work capacity. And that's what we do on day one. And pretty much try and do that every day before we work out. You know, and Brady and I are looking at each other like, what the hell? Like we are like literally just, you know, drenched in sweat. We're gassed. We have like, can't even think straight. Can't even ask questions straight. But that was a good time. And then the next day we were there for another day two. We were a little bit more in depth with Louis. And I mean, he's a funny character. I don't know if you've ever met him or really heard him talk, but you know, he's just a little dude, and you know, he's hilarious. But the things he had to say were just, you know, just awesome things just to kind of hear, just like hear his story, hear where he came from, you know, his mission, his goals, you know, that he wants for his athletes. And like he really cares about people, and you can actually really see that and feel that when he talks about just the people in his gym and the athletes that he trains. Just a down-to-earth guy. So that was really cool. And then after Westside, we actually went back to Chicago. We got certified in RPR with Chris Corfus. And then, so that was neat. Chris is a really neat guy as well. I've met with him another time too. I was presenting some research in Chicago, actually on RPR. And I met with him just to talk more about RPR itself. And but he's always an awesome guy to talk to too. So then after that, we ended up going back to the East Coast, out to North Carolina, visited another, got some people like in the baseball realm, worked our way up to Massachusetts, and then there's another baseball place that we went to, and then we made it back and we were done. It was total 31 days.
That's awesome, man. You guys kind of covered everything there, and those are some cool names. And like I said, I'm a little jealous because that's always something that I've wanted to do. But you know, sometimes life gets in the way, and then you start making excuses like, oh, I can't take this time off to go do that. But I think that's such a cool idea, just to, like you said, just get it straight from the source instead of always listening to a podcast. Like, go out there, have a conversation with these people, and really pick their brain. And those are all guys that I'm super familiar with, at least for some of the bigger names that you mentioned. Like, I'm certified level 1 and 2 in RPR. I did mine in Chicago as well. Chris wasn't the teacher that day. It was one of his buddies that actually taught the course that day, who, funny enough, wasn't even certified in RPR, but like, he's just like Chris's best friend that has like been with him since day one. So Chris just lets him teach the course, that was kind of jokes. And then I did level 2 in Ohio at JL Holdsworth, at his gym at the Spot Athletics. So that's cool. And you've done your research on that as well. So that's pretty interesting. So tell me a little bit, cause I'm curious, like, tell me a little bit more about this, like, this research project you did about RPR, and like, what were some of the findings that you got from it?
Yeah. And I'm not with RPR. They're not paying me or anything like that. So whatever I'll say is I'm just going to report the findings. But what we looked at, and we looked at with trained athletes, so we weren't looking for Joe Schmo just off the street, but we were making sure that, you know, these individuals had either played a sport or they were like well fit. And essentially I wanted to see, you know, does RPR actually work? Like,
Yeah. A great question.
You know, does it actually work, you know, and does it actually stick? Because one of the biggest questions that I had, and one of the things that I always observed, was I could hit an RPR spot. Okay. It makes them reflexively stronger. But then if I add a simple stimulus, like say the ABCs backwards, tap them on the forehead, change their breathing rate, have them just stand up, walk around, sit back down, they would get knocked out. And so they would test weak again. And so it's like, okay, so if I can hit this spot, create this awareness to this area, but now if they get up and let's say, if, you know, they're playing football and somebody hits them the wrong way, does that mean they're just going on and off, on and off, on and off? Like, it just didn't make sense to me. So I was like, all right, let's research it. And because I am certified, I was the one that performed RPR on people. And then we would make sure, like when we went through the method section, we would make sure that like we didn't tell them like anything. Like it wasn't like, hey, this is what's going to happen. So they were clueless. They didn't know it was, all they knew was I was going in. Obviously, you know, they signed waivers and everything was cleared and whatnot, but I went through, I hit the spots, and then I would check the spot. So I made sure that, you know, if there wasn't a spot that was activated, I made sure, like I went back, activated it, checked everything. And then essentially what we were looking for was we did 10-yard accelerations. So we had 3 different days. We had like a glute activation day, an RPR day, and then just like a normal dynamic warm up. So we had 3 different of those. They were all randomized. So like a subject would come in, they don't know if they're doing dynamic, whatever, RPR, whatever. And we looked at it, and so like they would sprint 10 yards and then they would go and, you know, we do RPR and then come back and see what happens. But essentially we were going through the data and we found that quad activation decreased and hamstring activation increased, which just, and it was a positive correlation. And I didn't expect that, to be honest. So even though I know that sometimes athletes are getting knocked off, what I thought, like reflexively is changing, there's definitely something is altering at the neuromuscular level. And I can't fully explain it. I can create a theory or you know, provide an opinion on that, but I don't really know. Something is sticking, but I don't know. And so that was just an interesting finding though. To know that like, hey, this actually there might be something here.
Yeah, there's something to this. Yeah, and that's like, even when you talk to the guys, like the 3 founders of RPR, JL, Chris, and Cal, like even they say like, we don't really know why. All we know is that, you know, we've seen great impacts from it. And that's why I signed up. Like, that's why I went and did it. It was just for genuine curiosity. I'm like, this sounds like horse crap. Like, there's no way that this works like that. But you know what? These 3 guys are guys that I've learned from, guys that I, you know, look up to within the industry and respect the work that they've done and what they're doing. I was like, you know what? I don't really feel like this is just a cash grab for them. So I'll take a road trip down to Chicago right before Christmas here. I'll bring my girlfriend. We'll have some fun. And then I'll go do this course and we'll see what it's all about. And honestly, like I got really banged up at the end of my football career. My last 2 seasons, I played my 4th year with a broken navicular or stress fracture in my navicular in my foot, and I had a partially torn hamstring as well. And then in the final game of the year, I snapped my arm in half. And then none of those things got rectified throughout the off season. So when I played my 5th year, my arm was still slightly broken, my foot was still slightly screwed up, and my hamstring was still giving me problems. So it was a pretty miserable experience my last 2 years playing football. But I had persistent, like that foot pain that I had, even though everything had healed, that pain I had in my foot was persistent. I never quite had that pop off my foot. And that was like 2 years that I had that. Literally, we went to RPR 1. They did some resets, and then the guy, he actually went in, he did some of the level 2 stuff on me. He's like, I'm not going to teach you about this. I'm just going to do it to you. My foot pain went away. I could pop, like my vert probably just immediately probably was in 5 inches higher just from having that pop back. It was insane. Like it blew my mind when it happened to me. And same to your point, like it stuck. Like my foot pain never really came back. And when it did come back, I just did the things that he showed me and it went away. So the first time he reset it, I'll do some air quotes just in case. He reset it and it lasted for a day and a half and then it came back. So I did it. Then it lasted for a week. Then I did it. Like it lasted for a couple months. Like it was just like one of those things where it's like, I still doesn't really fully make sense to me, but there's got to be something there. And like, hey man, I'm pretty happy my foot doesn't hurt every time I take a step anymore. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah. And I will say this too is, so when I met with Corfus in Chicago, because that was one of the things I asked him about, because, you know, and I don't mind full out saying like, telling Chris that I think this stuff's bogus. And I don't really care what people think, but, you know, he told me that that's what level 3 was for. And apparently like, you know, they found for level 3, they found ways to essentially clear that, you know, where people are having the problems where they would get up and it seemed like people would be knocked out. So, you know, to their own system, they've kind of developed that there definitely is a hierarchy. And if you don't get the prime, you know, issue or the primary issue, then the secondary issues aren't going to go away. If you just keep addressing secondary issues, don't hit the primary, those issues are always going to exist. And I'll say from what we know now or at least from what I know now, this is just kind of my opinion, but you know, you hit those spots and you can actually, you know, if there's parts of the body, you know, so like think of the brain, like the body is this like mapping system and you have this brain that's kind of like this navigator. You know, if there's an injured area, your body's going to shut down a certain part of that area because it doesn't feel stable.
Yeah.
And if there's no stability, it's going to compensate. It's going to find a different firing pattern, essentially. And that firing pattern may not be the most optimal. Now, what we know is that there's certain maneuvers that you can do on the body that can re-stimulate the muscle spindle fibers and essentially desensitize the GTO.
Yeah.
So some of the spots that they actually hit, and also too, because they're followed around old Eastern Chinese medicine and they follow lymphatic and organs and whatnot, you know, they're also hitting organ systems. And you know, one of the biggest things, if you don't have a properly functioning organ system, that also might mean that you might not have a muscle that be firing right.
Yeah. So
if you can re-stimulate an organ, that can potentially then re-stimulate a muscle. Or if it's, you know, RPR is done on a certain spot where, because I see it all the time, and just in the shins and the feet, where if you re-stimulate that GTO, that muscle, or desensitize it and re-stimulate the muscle spindle fibers, it kind of sticks on, because the body, because, you know, from birth, the body knows the most efficient pathway. We just kind of fuck it up, you know, as we go through life.
Yeah, we do.
So once you re-show the body the most efficient pathway, it locks onto that. That's why it's simply like one movement can knock somebody out and one movement can easily fix them. It's obviously a lot more complex than that, but really that's.
Yeah. Well, it's like, and we don't want to get too deep into the weeds on this, but it's just like a survival thing, right? Like those movement patterns are primarily kind of ingrained into our bodies because it's what saves the most energy. It's what's, like you said, the most efficient way to move, because like we want to ultimately survive. And part of that is always conserving energy. So, you know, that's why we are designed to move that way. And like you said, the 21st century lifestyle just messes that up. Pretty much from the get-go, right? Like even nowadays with kids, like they're getting messed up at younger ages now than they were before. And I'm only 27, right? Like, and I've seen that in the kids that I've trained, and I've seen that just observationally looking around and seeing my brother and his friends and how they were a little different than mine, and seeing younger kids. It's like there is a little bit of a de-evolution there.
Mm-hmm, for sure. There's a great quote I saw the other day. Buckminster Fuller, he said that we were all born geniuses, and then as we go on through life, we all de-genius. So what's happening? So
it is, and hopefully we can right the ship and prevent this from snowballing to be 10 times worse than it already is. But yeah, honestly, just never know in 2020. You never know which way this is going to go. So that's awesome. Like that's a ton of great background information. I think people can kind of really like grasp on to where you've kind of pulled your education or maybe your philosophy from. I
Mhm.
know one of the things that I heard you talk about with Jake Tura on his podcast, and something that we were talking about before, is how you use isometrics. So if we want to kind of dive in on that, and
Mhm.
if it connects with your philosophy from RPR, that's not part of it at all. For like, have free reign here, letting us know kind of how you use isos and how that progresses over time. If there's any like standards that you think people should try and hit, like let us know.
Sure. I think the best way to look at, I would say, is that, when you do isometrics, there is definitely a right way to do them. And that right way to do them is different for everybody. But I always talk about some of the key things that I look for. But if you look at how people do isometrics today, or at least on Instagram, because they're pretty popular, uh, they're they're done. I would say everyone does them wrong, but like 99.9999% of people have no idea what the hell they're doing. There's a huge, I didn't create this acronym. This is where Jay Schroeder methodology, and what really got me going on the isometrics was listening to podcasts from Jay Schroeder and making all these crazy claims of, pulling somebody behind a van at 30 miles per hour and making sure that the rope is perfectly at the right angle, and having people run, athletes of his running 3, 6, 40-yard times. And so you hear all these things and you're like, what the hell? Like this isn't true. And so, going back to what I learned from Cal, everything that somebody says, you should test out. And so, the more I dug into his stuff, I couldn't explain the why, but the more that I, learned about isometrics, and one of the persons that I learned from isometrics probably the most was Dr. Mark Wetzel, who's a chiropractor out in Nashville. And I listened to his podcast on Just Fly Sports, and I ended up reaching out to him. And sorry, this is a little bit context, but then I'll go more into
No,
it.
no,
I
no.
ended up reaching out to him, and him and I would like respond like back and forth all day, like all night. It was kind of weird, to be honest, at first. And then he finally said, just come out to Nashville and we'll just go through everything. And so I went out to Nashville for a week and just observed in his office, watched what he did, and then essentially just learned. And then we had constant communication, and now we visit each other, back and forth all the time. But a lot of it is, seeing what he had, what he had to share, and then my own, self-discovery. And then we just kind of go back and forth in collaboration or whatnot. But I'll say the biggest thing, I'll probably go a little bit more in depth into that later. But the biggest thing that I look for essentially with isometrics is that they need to be done in a perfect positioning. Positioning is everything. And so if you look at somebody's positioning and just look at how they compensate, I'll pick on myself, even as I talk to you right now, like I've been leaning over to this way, my head's been going this way. My eyes have been looking over to the right. Like these are just certain things that you have to be aware of. Like, when, we're going under some sort of stress or we're going under something, like how does the body compensate? How does it organize itself? And so that's why position is key. And you want to put yourself in the most basic position possible. And by doing that, you're essentially you're allowing your muscles to work in the most efficient pathway because they're happening in the most lengthened state. Now, the lengthened state is extremely important. We can talk about the physiology of that a little bit later if you want, but I'll just keep talking about the positions if necessary. But so you want the good positions, you want the lengthening, you want good 90-degree angles. And then after somebody holds that position, the body is going to then immediately start compensating. So torso is going to be changing, breath is going to change. There's going to be an overpowering muscle, and then there's also going to be muscles that don't even fire. So somebody that's very quad dominant, you talk about like RPR or whatnot, make a connection there. If they're holding a lunge or a wall sit, they should be able to engage their hamstring just as hard as the quad. And we know gravity is going to be acting upon the quad, making the quad to contract. But now can we tell our brain to get that muscle to contract? And that's one of the biggest things where people struggle with and do things wrong too, is where they just hang out in an isometric. They just think that it's just holding a position. And that's completely inaccurate. You know, your whole goal is to figure out how to stabilize your joints at 100% intensity. And one of the cool things about that too is if you don't, if you only contract one side of the muscles, obviously that's not going to stabilize a joint. It also means too, if one side of the muscle group isn't firing, then that certain muscle group isn't going to be able to, I'm going to say the word, but this is linguistics. People go crazy on Instagram, but absorb force. You know, people hate that word because it's impossible.
How dare you?
You know, I know. But, you know, if one of those sides of the muscles isn't working and it's not contracting, then you're not going to train it to be able to absorb force, essentially. So, and also too, with that, Brady actually sent me some cool articles because we always knew this, that if you contract both sides of a muscle around a joint and you contract it as hard as you can, that's high velocity. The reciprocal inhibition, the agonist and antagonist, we always knew that that was happening at high velocities, but we can never put a number to that. Research has shown that those muscles oscillate anywhere between 15 and 30 times per second. And even before that, your brain will go through a movement twice before you even conduct the movement. So your brain's firing 2 times faster than what your peripheral nervous system is firing. So that's one of the biggest things why it's so important to contract and be able to stabilize at a perfect positioning in that lengthened state too, because if in the most lengthened state, if you can train your muscle to contract in that lengthened state, then the brain knows how it got there, which is extremely important. And that's huge. Just think of running, you know, the hip flexors, everything, like hamstrings, like all that stuff is firing in length. I'm in the baseball realm. So pitchers, you know, when they have to go back and they're cocking back, like if I were to contract my pec here, and if I were to keep going back, and if this pec loses its contraction, then I know that this is all the range that it has. Even though I might be going all the way back here, that means my body is compensating and not using the most appropriate muscles, or that muscle isn't completely lengthened. So kind of all over, but essentially, I mean, these are things that I'm looking for is, you know, how hard can you contract when you get into an isometric? What muscles are contracting? What muscles aren't contracting? What is your breath doing? Is your breath high? Is it low? Where are you looking? What are your eyes doing? What muscle gives out first? So those are just kind of basic things that I'm looking for. And probably what I should say too is that one of the biggest things that got me on using isometrics, I mean, originally I was just going to use them as an eval, or not as an eval, as a GPP for like 2 weeks. But I quickly realized that they're the perfect eval for somebody, because now I can evaluate somebody in less than 30 seconds. I know exactly all their compensations, whether they favor their foot positioning, how their foot functions, what side of the foot they function on, what muscles don't work, how their breathing is going to go, and all that's going to correlate over to on the field. You know, and prior to that, I would do everything on a table. You know, you measured lengths and whatnot. But everybody knows that somebody can look very shitty on a table and then to go and be the best athlete out in the competitive sport. So to me, there is a huge problem there. And once I found that, you know, isometrics happen at high velocities and they happen at the same rate as competitive speeds happen at, that's when I was like, okay, like this is how we know isometrics are going to transfer, like for sure, high velocity movements.
Yeah.
And that's everything.
Which I'm sure is like, even just saying that, that's a pretty big paradigm shift for some people to think of, right? Like how is something where I'm staying stationary, how is that a high velocity movement, right? And
right, exactly.
that's the pushback that you're going to have if people can't understand that oscillatory contraction that's happening at the actual fiber level, right? Just because they don't see movement happening, they don't associate velocity with that, right?
Yeah. And so let's talk about that. So, you know, you're in a stationary position. So how do, you know, just like that, how do the muscles reciprocate that fast? And so if you are holding a position, then the oscillation increases. But as you move through the position, the oscillation decreases. So if I were to do a rep, it might only oscillate once. But here's the thing though, is if all you train is repetitions, then the issue is then you are limited on your current ability to relax. Because like if I'm in a stationary position and I just squeeze my muscles as hard as I can, I'm training my muscles, this neural coding, I'm training them to relax faster. And then if I can train them to relax faster, then I know that's going to carry over and I'm going to be able to run faster. And if all you're doing is reps or going through movements, or if you're even doing just squats or barbell training, you have to understand that that is slowing down your movement. So you're actually slowing your nervous system down. And, you know, and we kind of grasp this because like the concept right now is like, you know, heavy eccentrics, barbell training, big, you know, we need lots of mass, we need big muscles, because bigger the muscle, the more force they're going to transfer. And then we go into this like phase where we go into this peaking phase, where we do like overspeed or high velocity ballistic type movements. And then the athlete's ready. So it's like this idea that that's the progression that we need to go to. But, you know, and I'll say this too, is what Brett and I found when we were, because Brett and I ended up working, we ended up working together in Springfield. And I'll tell you, I completely underestimated that guy. Honestly, it was kind of funny when we first went, talked to each other on the phone. I pretty much did all the talking. He didn't do any of the talking. And then I told him, I was like, you know, I'm having like 16, 20 athletes at a time. Like, I can't even handle this. Like, you want to come out and work? And so, he's like, yeah, I'll come out and work, essentially. And I'll tell you this, you know, we had, and this is all of Brett. This would have never happened if Brett never came. You know, we talk about, you know, niches, you know, how everybody puts everybody into a niche or whatnot. I'll tell you, the best advice I ever got from that guy was he told me that nothing is outside your realm. And as soon as he said that to me, and it was pretty early on, and that was like probably one of the best things that he ever said to me. But, you know, he came in around Christmas time. I was working on 2 months of isometrics with all my athletes. Basically, they came in, they're already lifting at school and whatnot. And when I mean lifting, it was just the crazy random like ass CrossFit would be like, hey, today we're going to do stairs for 30 minutes. And then we're going to go do a 1 rep max of a squat and a deadlift. And then the next day was like, all right, we're 1 rep maxing again. And then we're going to do like burpees, like a triangle, like a, you know, a triangle burpee series. And so everybody was coming to me like injured, to be honest. And so I was like, okay, we're not going to do it. We're going to do isometrics. We're going to fix all these terrible compensation patterns. Just get all your muscles firing straight. So that's all we did for, I think it was either 2 or 3 months. And we just did that straight. Nobody touched the barbell. And the kids kind of understood it. And the best way that I could describe it to them was like, you know, if you're looking at when you play your sport, you know, do you play a sport with your barbell on the back? You know, and they don't. And so they're like, no, I don't play a sport. You know, my sport doesn't, like, I don't have to hit with a barbell on my back. So I'm like, okay, so shouldn't you be able to know how to control your muscles, how your actual sport is played? And they'd be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And they'd be like, okay, so now also too, if we're going to generate more force and more power production, your muscles need to be in the most lengthened state possible. Because if your muscle has, let's say, you know, if this is my muscle length and this is all my capacity, as you fatigue, all fatigue is a shortened muscle. So as you keep, your muscle keeps fatiguing, it gets shorter, shorter, and shorter, and then boom, it has no capacity anymore. So if you have a longer muscle and you start with a longer muscle, then you have a longer area to work with. So the whole point of the isometrics was to lengthen your muscles out, increase that capacity. And we know that when muscles lengthen back out, this goes a little bit more into the physiology of it. Blood, you're basically training blood to get more into those areas, and then hydrogen ions to get out. So like the burning sensation or lactic acid or whatever, it's just because hydrogen ions can't get out. They're trapped in there. And so when you do that, you're training the work capacity, and then also the neuromuscular junctions are increasing, which then also means you're starting to recruit larger motor units. And this is essentially where you get hypertrophy and force output. Even though you're not moving anything, you're starting to get those things. So, and I guess I'm going all over the place, but I'll go back to that's what we did for 2 months, or two to 3 months. Then Brett came in, and this is the important part, and was that when we tested guys, and we didn't run that often, but essentially Brett had 8th graders running sub 1.4 flying, or sub 1.4 10-yard accelerations. We had a juniors in high school running a 1.27 10-yard acceleration from dead stops. And it wasn't just like random. It was like they were repeating 1.30, 1.36, 1.34. And then randomly the 1.27 came, but I mean, we know that was legit because he ran a 1.3, you know, before that. Like I said, 8th graders running that slow or running that fast. And that just blew my mind, because if you were to correlate that out, that's an 8th grader running essentially a 4.440.
Yeah.
And so this is where people think that Brett is just the perception and action kind of guy. And he's not. Like he brings so much more to the table. And that's honestly what makes him so dangerous, is because people don't know about him because he doesn't want people to know about him. You know, he's kind of that kind of guy. You know, and when
he's
ready,
mysterious a little bit.
He is, for sure. And so, you know, that was just wonderful being able to work with him. I know there's a lot of times where he was just crafting away, and literally like, I just want to bring popcorn and just watch him work. Like essentially that's what it was like, you know. And sometimes he'd be like, oh, like get in this, because he's always working with athletes, and be like, oh, come on, get in this. And I'm just like, no, I'm going to let right now the artist paint this, you know, this beautiful canvas. And I'm just going to observe right now. Like, I'm just going to take this all in. So, you know, it's hard, you know, you can't really specifically say, you know, did their speed times come because we fixed all their compensation patterns? Yeah, you could say that, but also I know too, like none of that would happen without, you know, Brett actually, the things that he does and the creativity that he has alone or whatnot. So, but we continue to do, like, we never did barbell. We never really did jumping. We didn't really do tons of sprint work. A lot of it was just high velocity movements, getting people to fire at high velocities, whether that meant isometrics in a stationary position or other little gimmicks that made sure that people fired at high velocity.
That's awesome. So, like, do you have like a staple list of like keystone positions that you're trying to hit in the isometrics, or is it always just a lunge for you, or is that completely like individualized based on the athlete and how they present and their specific compensations?
Yeah.
Like, how are you doing that, and then how are you progressing the isos over time? Are you trying to hold it for longer, or is it almost, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but hopefully you kind of do.
There's a lot of really good questions in that. So no, I use a lot of things other than the lunge. The lunge is just easy. So here's what I'll say about this. Your isometric, so this is where intention comes into pipes. So I can't remember if I mentioned earlier, but you know, every time that you train, you need to train physiologically, intellectually, physiologically, intellectually, and spiritually. So every single time you train, all of those aspects need to be working in coherence. There isn't one that works more than the other. And so this is where your intention piece, when you do your isometrics, have to line up exactly with what you're trying to do, because everything to me is a skill. And so if you want to get good at, you know, squatting, you got to squat. If you want to get good at throwing a baseball, you got to throw a baseball, like whatever it is. So when you're doing the isometrics, you have to treat it in the same way that your sport movement takes place. And so what I mean by that is, like, if I'm doing a lunge, then I need to make sure that when I'm doing my lunge, it's a slow motion. I treat it as a slow motion sprint. And so that I know, like, hey, this rear leg, my quad needs to be extending. I know that my knee needs to slightly be internal rotation. I can't be external rotated dominant. I need to make sure that, like, my back foot's driving off my big toe. My front foot, I need to make sure my glutes engaged. I need to make sure my hips aren't, you know, turned weird. Posture's up good. And so, and then when I go to contract my muscles, you should have the control over your muscles to be able to know what muscles need to shorten, depending on, you know, what position they're in. And then you also should be able to have the ability to eccentrically contract your muscles. And that's why it's, intention's everything. Because if you don't go in it and you just go in, okay, I'm just going to hold this and I'm just going to try and squeeze all my muscles as hard as I can, all you're doing, like, you're lacking the connection piece to what actually matters. And that's what you always need to stay focused on, is what actually matters, my competitive sport, and being able to move better for that. So now if I'm a pitcher, and I kind of mentioned earlier, like if I'm going back and I'm going to do a slow motion throw, and, and I'm going out and I'm working behind, if my pec doesn't work here, that's a problem. So then if I'm going to do any sort of ISO, if I'm going to do a row, if I'm going to do a negative push-up, I need to make sure now that my intention is to eccentrically contract that pec, and then concentrically contract whatever muscles need to be contracting. And then that goes even more in depth into, our body works in coiling and spiral rotation. So it's not just, even though an isometric is in this 90-90 position, we don't run in 90-90 positions. We have a ball and ball and joint sockets or whatever, so our hips are moving around. So that's why it's so important to be able to contract your muscles in such a way that's going to mimic the coil as well. And I don't mean like actual getting into a coiled position, but your intention is to get your muscles contract that way. And I guess an example of that would be what I see all the time is people are extremely externally rotated dominant. They would get into a wall sit, a lunge, really anything. And if this was I'm kind of off here, but if this was my knee, just so people, if they're not watching a video or whatnot, but essentially I have my arm straight out ahead of me and I have my elbow joints here. But if this was my knee, most people's are externally rotated. So like, do you have the ability to contract your muscles in such a way that can bring this elbow joint into internal rotation, or your knee into internal rotation, while keeping your hand straight out, or foot? Can the knee contract in such a way where that goes in, or hips going in internal rotation while the foot is staying forward? And so that's the intention piece that goes behind it. And this is very difficult for people to get into, and this is very difficult for people to understand, because it's mentally draining. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about tolerance. Why a lot of people don't jump on this bandwagon is because they try it out, but they don't know what they're doing. Positions might suck, and then they might they just don't see the progress. Or what we've put it in a niche of as lately is, it's more of just rehab. You hold this, and then it's going to fix your, patellar pain or whatever and whatnot. But, yes and no, because, one of the things I like to talk about is you just become more efficient at being inefficient. So like if I had, this is kind of going off topic, we're going everywhere, but, if I had pain, so let's say you're an athlete and you have pain, whatever, in your knee, or whatever it might be. If a lot of the research shows that you should just do like some sort of overcoming ISO, or just hold something. Now, for that, if I'm holding just a lunge, my quad essentially, because gravity is going to kind of be making it contract, which is going to be kind of like, so like anytime a muscle contracts or shortens concentrically, it's a 1A pathway. So it's a 1A motor unit. It provides a lot of information. Essentially, it's allowing for movement. And then the opposite would be a 1B, which would be your GTO, Golgi tendon organ, which is going to be an inhibition. And this is how we move too. So like, if I have pain or whatever, and all I do is just keep strengthening the 1A, sure, I might get some pain go away a little bit, because by contracting that's going to be stimulating muscle fibers and then desensitizing the GTO there essentially. But you're going to have the problem keep coming back and back if you don't get both sides to actually contract and work together. Mm-hmm. Because the whole purpose of it is, if you can get the hamstring to actually shorten, then that's going to actually then truly lengthen out the quad, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Because they're working reciprocally on either side of the joint.
Right. And all you're doing is just training one side. Like I said, you're just going to be becoming more efficient and being inefficient. But if you get both sides to work, then they're going to be more balanced.
Yeah. So really for you, in terms of like, and again, this is pretty much true for all things in coaching, but for you, it's all boiling down to the intention that you're bringing to that practice, and really building the awareness, like isometrics, I guess, are you're partially using as a tool to help build awareness towards where certain muscles are, what it feels like when certain muscles are contracting. And
Yeah.
the byproduct of that is obviously there are some training adaptations, but really for you, it sounds like it's almost a cognitive thing where you're trying to educate athletes on this is what optimal feels like for your body, and then getting them comfortable and ability, like you said, you're tying that into breathing, or getting them to mentally try and tie that into their specific sporting action. And then that's how you're kind of taking all these things, stacking them together to actually see a benefit on the field.
Yeah. No, beautiful. That's a really
That
good
was
summary.
that was a good summary. All right, nailed it.
Yeah,
There we go.
yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. It's mindfulness.
Yeah.
So the most of the issues, like if you're going to have decreased force output, you're going to have increase of injuries or whatever, if your body doesn't have the proprioception, if it doesn't have the spatial awareness of how your body is moving in space.
Yeah.
And so if your body compensates in such a way where muscles aren't contracting and they're not stabilizing joints the way they need to, that's going to leave you more prone to injury, or you're not going to be able to have as good a force output. And that's a key thing too, is what comes to mindfulness is you have to train your body to do it. You can't have some sort of external object or, manipulation on it to get you to do it. And that's one of the biggest things with overcoming is like, it's a different pathway.
Yeah.
Because it's not, it's like, essentially, I mean, this is kind of cheesy, but it's like, teach a man how to fish and he can fish forever, but, just give him the fish and that's it. He's just got that one fish. So that's kind of like, not exactly, but that's kind of what it is with isometrics when it's going to yielding versus overcoming, is that if you can train your body, it might be harder, might take a lot longer, but if you train it how to contract, you're going to be doing a lot better in the long run. For sure.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And there's a ton of gold there. And I know there's a handful of people that will listen to that will be really beneficial for them. I guess the last thing on that topic, just to get some clarity for people, just because a lot of the people that listen to this are like athletes or just kind of people that aren't coaches necessarily. Do you want to differentiate between yielding and overcoming isometrics?
Yeah, sure. So yielding is essentially when gravity is acting upon. So if I'm just holding a position and essentially so think of this. So all my muscles from my waist up, this is important for the context, but all of my muscles from my waist up essentially are flexors. And then from the waist down, the backside would be the flexors. So does that make sense? Like hamstrings are going to be the flexors up top. Yeah. The biceps are going to be the flexors. So it's important to know that relationship. And then it's important to know that when you're holding a position, what gravity is acting upon them. So like a yielding now would be gravity is acting upon my quad. If I'm holding my arm out, it's acting upon my front shoulder or whatever. Overcoming is if I were to push into it. So now it's no longer eccentrically contracting. It's more of this concentric action. So I'm pushing into an object. I'm actively trying to shorten something. And so, I mean, essentially that's the biggest difference. Gravity versus a push. So a pull versus a push. Yeah. And what I'll tell you too is, this is very key too, is that if you want to move faster, you need to learn how to pull, not push. If all you're doing is push dominant, you're not going to be moving that fast. Or if you are already moving fast, like you can benefit a crap ton by just learning how to pull.
Yeah.
And that's one of the hardest things is too, when it goes back to these isometrics, essentially like you're almost doing an overcoming isometric opposed to gravity. Like gravity is trying to push you down, but your other half of the muscles, you're trying to keep yourself up.
Yeah.
And eventually those are going to be slowly giving out. You're slowly going to be dropping down lower and lower, sinking deeper and deeper into a position. But each time you're trying to oppose gravity. So.
Perfect. Yeah. Just thought that would be worthwhile just because I'm sure a handful of people that will listen to this conversation won't understand really Not to any fault of their own, right? They don't live in our world necessarily, but yeah, just
I jump around everywhere. So if you need clarification somewhere, you just let me know.
no, it's
Otherwise,
all good, and it's all over the place. But that's conversation, right? And you're
yeah,
connecting
exactly.
the dots about how one thing influences another, or providing context. So don't sweat it, man. It's been great. Um, so what I was gonna say was, why don't you maybe try and just provide like one lower, like we've talked about the lunge a lot. So you've talked about how you would cue that, and what are the awareness pieces that you're trying to bring to the front of the brain for athletes in those positions. Why don't you provide a quick like walkthrough of what's a good solid like upper body position, and then how you're describing that similar interaction between like antagonist and agonist and that kind of stuff.
Sure.
Just so that people, if anyone was listening, they're like, hey, you know what? Like, I have a reference point now. I'm going to go and try this lunge. I'm going to think about the things that Jarod talked about, try and give them something for the upper body so that they can build a similar awareness.
Yeah. I mean, it really depends on,
Like a push-up hold, or like an
sure.
ISO and a push-up, maybe just walk them through
Sure.
that, just so that people can kind of have a reference point, like I kind of said there.
Yeah. So push-ups are honestly probably one of the hardest exercises. People don't think about that, but I'll say what good positioning is first.
Yeah.
And then maybe that'll be a little bit easier to understand. But essentially, when it comes to the upper body, the biggest things that you want to focus on is, what's your rib positioning doing? Is your ribs flaring? Is it tucked? And then also too, you want to know where your shoulders are. They rounded forward? Are they back? Are your scaps locked into position? Are they pinned against the thoracic wall? Or are they winging off? Your neck is going to be huge. So whether somebody's neck is protruding forward, if it's tilted a direction, so that's going to tell you a lot. And then just observational wise, majority of people have very, very tight biceps. So you see people that walk around and they can't straighten their arms. That's a huge issue, especially if you want to try and tap into your lats and sprint faster. I mean, this is just a side note, but if your biceps are over short, your lats actually attach into your humerus right around your bicep. So if your biceps are short, that's going to disrupt the function of the whole of the lats. And we know if that you want to sprint fast, your lats got to be firing and they got to be firing efficiently. And that whole chain needs to be working. So that's kind of a side note. So one of the best things you can do now, so I guess this is the agonist antagonist. If your biceps short, then you need to figure out how to lengthen it. And if you're going to lengthen a muscle, you have to take the muscle to its end tension point, and then you have to contract the opposite side. So that means I have to take my arm straight out, or however far I can keep it straight. And then I have to think about contracting my tricep super short. And the shorter that I contract my tricep, the more that it's going to allow my bicep to lengthen out. And you can keep that, or you can take that any part of the body, hamstring, quad, hip flexors, glutes, or whatever it might be. So with the push-up, essentially, that's what you're looking for. And I have people start on a wall, where they're doing a wall push-up even before they get down, because you might be able to think you can do a push-up, but you really can't do a push-up.
Yeah.
And so honestly, I'll switch to something that's a little bit easier, a good thing to start with. And that might be like a front delt or a lateral delt, or like a row or something, or even as simple as like a bicep curl against the wall, because let's do a bicep curl against the wall, because that will allow you to feel if your scap's like actually locked in position. And when you stand against the wall, so one of the things that, even comes before isometrics is honestly learning to stand at attention. So like if you're just, you can do this after the podcast, or anybody could do this, but if you go stand against the wall and you have your feet, against the wall, you're trying to be completely flat against the wall, and you'll stand there and you'll probably feel awkward as hell. Mm-hmm. Your neck your chin will probably be popping up, ribs will be flaring, your whole back will be off the wall. It's just going to feel very awkward. And essentially, if you can fix that positioning by engaging your pelvis correctly, engaging your rib cage correctly, and the pressures of your feet correctly, then you're going to know what position you really need to be in for the upper body. Because it's kind of hard for me to like say, hey, scaps here, making sure arms straight out, these are engaged. You really need to just feel it. And so maybe that's like one of the best things for somebody to feel is like, okay, if they just start standing attention against the wall, and then they go into like, okay, now I'm going to add a bicep curl. So now I'm just going to have my elbow not on the wall, but maybe just a little bit off, and I'm going to squeeze at 90 degrees. And then as I squeeze, does immediately my shoulder round forward? Or can I keep my scap pinned against? And what you'll notice is be like, oh, my shoulder is against the wall, but boom, rib cage just flared. And then you go tuck your ribs down. And then because your ribs just got tucked down, your head shoots back up. And then you go and tuck your chin again, and then rib cage goes. And then it's just this never ending cycle of how your body's constantly compensating. And that for me too, that's nothing bad. But it's just, I always make sure when I'm watching my athletes, you know, how does, if you focus on one muscle group, how does that influence the other? You know, so if I tell you to put more pressure on the inside edge of your foot, well, what happens then to everything else? You know, if I tell you to contract your hamstring or your tricep, what happens? Because they could contract the hamstring, and like I said, the shoulder just completely rounds forward. And obviously, when you go and play a sport, you're not trying to be this rigid person. Like you're not like, obviously you can't move, like you can't throw if your scaps are just pinned against the, you know, the wall the entire time. But the whole point is to put your muscles in the most optimal working position so that it's creating stability around the joints, so that when you go be athletic or you go be free, your body can just do what it needs to do naturally, you know? And so it's not, you know, you're not teaching change of direction. You're not teaching somebody how to really squat or move. All you're doing is just teaching their muscles to work properly. Because if you teach them how to for their muscles to work properly, that's what's going to carry over. That's what's going to be the change of direction. That's what's going to be, you know, them to be able to get into XY position, a mobility range they never thought they'd be able to get into, because their muscles just know how to work now. And that's essentially what we want. And honestly too, like any like speed performance, or result, I should say, like throwing, whatever the results may be, honestly, that's all secondary to what isometrics can really provide. Because it's honestly about cleaning up your overall health. So like, you know, holistic health, like cleaning up, teaching your body how to use nutrients more efficiently, getting rid of excess waste. And if you just clean up all of that and you get all your organs working together, you get neurocoding working better, that's when you see the actual performance side actually really increase.
Yeah, like you said, that's a downstream effect of all of those behind the scene things that are happening. But the trick is, that's how you can get people to do it, right? If you just tell them about all this other stuff, like especially like I'm thinking younger athletes in mind here, right? Like you tell them, hey, this is going to help your body work optimally and your organs and this and that. They're going to be like, yeah, dude, I don't care. I want to be better at football or baseball or whatever. So it's, you dangle that carrot in front of them to get them to do all the other stuff that you know is the benefit, but you got to sell them on the thing that's important to them.
Yeah. And that's where I would say, like, you know, you said, so easy, because you got to feel it. I can't just tell people, and it's different for somebody else, but
yeah.
You know, just,
and I threw you on the spot there. I was just
no, you're good. But that's honestly the best way I can think of answering it, is like standing at attention.
Yeah.
Just get against the wall, and then as soon as you feel everything that's so awkward and just out of place and in balance, that's when you actually start learning that when you get into the positions of what it needs to be like.
Yeah.
Or if I'm going to sit, you know, if I sit up tall here and I just practice standing up and then re-sitting down. Most people can't sit up and sit down. You know, like if I were to go to sit up, most people are going to go on their heels. They're not going to be able to engage hamstrings. They don't know how to pull into the ground. And then as they go into lower, they're probably just going to plop and fall. I mean, there's many times where, you know, I remember the first time trying to like sit and stand, and I was just trying to sit and stand for 2 hours, and I would get halfway up and I would just fall back on the ground because I couldn't pull into the ground. I couldn't engage my feet properly. And so boom, my ass just fell back down on the ground. Like, you know, but that's, it tells you a lot about you. And just breath wise as well, you know, can you breathe in for 4, exhale for 8? And how long can you do that? Most people can't exhale to 8. They're just stuck, you know, and when you're doing these isometrics, everything, you know, masterful piece, end result. Obviously it takes, there's tricks and there's different things that you can get to mastery to say, but when you do these isometrics, you should be able to squeeze as hard as you can, and then inhale for 4, exhale for 8, cool and calm, collective, focused on your intention, and your breath rate should never really change. But that's very, very, very difficult to get to. So,
oh yeah, yeah.
Essentially, all it is just, and this is why I think a lot of like breathing techniques or like PRI or people that do stuff like that, we knock them a lot of the times, but because they're just doing some of the most basic things, the most fundamental movements, taking you back to the most primitive state, they have such a profound impact on the body. And that's why, like, I really believe that that's just kind of why the isometrics just do so well, is because it's just retraining your muscles how to actually work, because the way that we train in the weight room isn't how the human body works.
Yeah.
I was even talking to Brett the other day with this, and the whole idea of a hinge, why do we teach people how to hinge? It might be great for a lifter, but really you think of a hinge observational wise, you see something folding, but is the femur going into the hip socket a hinge joint? It's not. It's a ball and socket, and it has to rotate around. So it's just, I think a lot of our movements are just getting away from actually true athletic movement, or true, I should say, natural human movement. But those are the things that people don't want to question. We get into the mindset of that this is the weight training and this is how you do it. And these are the, you need to know how to squat. You need to know how to hinge. You need to, I stopped looking at whatever movement patterns people look at now these days. Because I just care about how your body responds with the nervous system. And I want to make sure, like, it needs to line up with competitive sport. Like, because how you do an ISO doesn't mean shit if you go suck at your sport.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I need to make sure that my weight room training mimics exactly what's going to be happening and influencing your nervous system, so that neural coding is exactly what's happening when you go and play your competitive sport. And I'm not slowing you down.
Yep. And I'm like myself, like I'm just a curious cat, right? Like I've been brought up in this traditional strength conditioning world where, the 6 movement patterns, the barbell, we got our lifts, we've got our progressions, regressions, we got our lateralizations, we've got our periodization schemes, we've got this, we've got charts, blah, blah, blah. Like that was the world I grew up in, right? Like I decided that this is what I was going to pursue when I was like 15 years old.
Same.
So when I was in high school, I was fighting my brother to get on the computer so I could read every single article that Joe DeFranco had ever posted on his Axe Joe. Like I read every single one up until whenever I gave up on that project. I went back through the archives, and every night I would just read as many articles as I could until I got bored, and then I'd save my spot. Okay. And then the next day I'd pick it back up. And then, the Elite FTS crew and the West Side guys and Jim Wendler and 531, like that was my bread and butter. That was where I came. And I'm still on my journey of like discover, like I don't want to sound so corny there, but like that journey of discovery of trying to figure out what actually moves the needle forward. Because at the end of the day, that's all I give a shit about. The people that come to work with me, I want to help them move the needle forward, and maybe taking some of these different approaches that I was kind of brought up on. I was able to help a lot of people move the needle forward, and it really helped me move the needle forward myself. So I have that anecdotal experience as well. But what I've found is that at some point there's a ceiling there. And so if these means have some useful applications, I'm not willing to say that they don't, but it is in the bigger picture, what makes the most sense, what's going to move the needle forward, and what's going to put you in the best position long term. And this is how I've kind of, over the last year and a bit, I've started to explore way outside of my comfort zone or where I've come from, because I have questions that I want to answer, and I want to know what is optimal and what is hurting and what is helping. Like you hear James Smith, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he has that quote of like, the best are the best, not necessarily because of the work that they do or who they train with, but most often in spite of, right? They're just a genetic freak that doesn't matter if they're following any program, they're going to get to where they're going to get to. So,
well, I'll say this though. I'd almost not necessarily disagree, but there's plenty of research now that shows that we can change our DNA.
Yeah. And we don't, I'm not saying that you necessarily need to do the barbells or that core strength conditioning kind of like, you don't need to do that. But it has worked for a lot of people, but there are trade-offs
Well, and
there.
that's why I want to talk. Like, I think I should clarify too, is I'm not saying that you do that stuff and you're not going to get a transfer, or, you know, what is transfer anyway? That's a whole nother topic within itself.
Exactly.
But, you know, people gotten results, but I think this is where we need to think about things, is that we've been, you know, the Russians did it and now we're just following the Russians or whatever. But our performance that we get from increases from people is essentially capped. You know, like for so long, you know, people running a 40-yard, like our numbers that we have or that we measure people don't really break that. There seems to be a limit, and because all we know is the barbell. And so that's what we kind of just think of. Like, we know that there's going to be some sort of results, but it's not until you start challenging that and you just go out and you just explore. And that's kind of what I did. And I was blessed enough to be around people that forced me to be creative. But you start learning that once what we thought was the way really isn't the way, you know? And like I said, you can still get increases, and you know, you ask, why can you get increases? Well, it's still like you're still engaging your muscles. That's going to stimulate your cerebellum. It's going to stimulate your brain. You're working muscles. So it's not like you're not working muscles. So like, there's just tons of influence, tons of benefits you can get, but is it the most optimal way? And that's why I just like, are you just becoming inefficient at being efficient, or are you actually trying to be efficient to be efficient? Because you know, there is elite, or I don't want to use the word elite, but there's really good athletes, you know, that don't do, you know, we look at them on Twitter and the training that they're doing. What are they doing? But
what is this?
You know, they have ability where, you know, it's like, regardless of the training, they're just, you know, they can perform.
Yeah.
And so, but I guess essentially where I'm going with that is that I don't think we've really challenged the system. I think there's too much where there's just kind of this group of people that kind of like run the system. There's not a lot of like room for questioning, and you know, it's very much like, this is the sprinting way. These are the sprinting drills. These are the things you got to do. And you know, and I'm just trying to look at it from the outside. I'm try to be more research oriented and explore, and see, is that the best way? And you know, and we even have, you know, we have the results from it. Brett has the results from it. You know, I wanted to say that it was dumb that we had somebody running acceleration, you know, and two, like, it wasn't just in house. Like, we had athletes going out and they're going to showcases, and, you know, even laser times, their 10-yard accelerations are happening 1.5, 1.48. So it's not like it's just happening in our house, you know, with our laser times or whatever. It's other people's lasers too, that, you know, they're running the same time regardless of where they are, which is just huge. So it just shows that there's definitely other ways to train. We're still exploring them, and but what I will say is this. I think this would help kind of clarify what I'm really talking about. Is, you know, I mentioned earlier that a fatigued muscle is nothing more than just a shortened muscle, and that a recovered muscle must mean that it's a lengthened muscle. And when we train, when I say, you know, traditional barbell, everything that we're doing, we do it in such a way that's kind of push dominant, and all it's doing is shortening muscles. And so that's why you have to rest for a day or a couple of days, because it takes that long periods of time for your muscles to then lengthen out, to relax, to recover. But our training system, you're training every single day. I mean, I guess it's not really, I mean, it is my system, but it's just learned from other people, but with my own spin on it, I guess you could say. But anyway, you're training the body to always recover, to always lengthen. And that's why you can train for 4 hours a day. You can train 7 days in a row. You can train 30 days in a row, 40 days in a row. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, you can train 4 hours before going out and playing your sport. You say, how is that? Because mentally they feel dead. They might feel fatigued. They're sweating all crazy, but their muscles are lengthened back out. or even further into what they have actually done. So the biggest difference is I'm trying to train people to be the most efficient recoverers possible, and training their body to recover itself rather than just like, okay, we're going to lift, okay, muscles have shortened, now we need a couple days off, and then that's going to allow it. That rest of doing nothing is going to lengthen the muscles back out. Like I don't buy it. And I think one of the good examples is, I had a guy on a glute ham machine, and he had to do 100 reps under 2 minutes, and he'd had to do a minute hold, and then he'd have to do 100 reps, and there was no breaks. And the first time that he does the 100 reps, it takes him close to 10 minutes. And then the next time it's like 9 minutes, 8 minutes. And he's feeling like complete trash. There's even one point where he ended up actually going outside and puking. And I know a lot of people are going to get onto me that because, you're not supposed to make an athlete puke. But that's fine. And then, but essentially it got down to the point where it's like his 12th or like 15th time doing it. And he did 100 reps in 1 minute and 34 seconds. And he started out, his first rep took him 10 minutes. And so people's perception of just how they feel isn't always realistic, is what I find. Like they might feel sore, but it might not actually, like, just because you feel sore doesn't mean you're going to go play bad or whatnot.
Yeah.
And we were making sure, like, okay, you're doing the reps. What are the reps doing? You're shortening muscles, followed by a 1 minute hold. What are those doing? That's re-lengthening out your muscles. So we're constantly lengthening, shortening, lengthening, shortening, lengthening, shortening. And I mean, it just shows. And I've talked about this too with many other people, but if you come and train with me or whatnot, it's very typical on day one, you might be doing an hour of a wall set. You're doing 12 sets of 5, 24 sets of 5, 5 minutes. And it's not punishment. It's not, like this like initiation period. It's essentially like, no, you need to retrain your nervous system how to fire appropriately. And that's what it takes. And two, with this is, and Brett even mentioned this at the very end of the podcast that he did with you, just very briefly, but the whole concept of tolerance and pushing athletes beyond what they actually think they're capable of and doing it in an appropriate manner. When you want to quit, or when somebody wants to go down during an isometrics or any sort of thing, like they've hit a tolerance, like their body's given up. And if you want to keep pushing an athlete further and further, you have to keep breaking those tolerances, and you have to then, so the tolerance keeps getting greater and greater and whatnot. And people are kind of afraid of that. Like, Brett and I kind of talk about, we talk about auto-regulation. You talk about DB hammer system, and it's like, okay, you fatigue 3%, then you need 3 days rest. You fatigue 6%, you need 6 days rest. In one training session, we were taking guys all the way down to a 24% drop off. And then all of a sudden something happens. The body figures it out. And all of a sudden, now that what was originally one time what they hit their PR, now they're just sitting their PR. And then all of a sudden they get this breakthrough, and now they're running way faster. And we're just very, I don't know why, but just we're scared. We think athletes are fragile, and they're not. Like, the body isn't made weak.
No.
It's not made weak. And it's everything too. You go back to just high velocity movements. High velocity movements recover, because the faster you can relax, the faster you're recovered, essentially. And so if you're going to sprint and you're increasing that neural drive and your muscles have to relax faster, that means they're going to be recovering faster. You might say that that's crazy, but if we've trained them in such a way that they know their bodies know how to recover itself, and then we've got them even to the point where they can recover themselves as they sprint. And obviously that's not the only thing. We're doing other things, such as monitoring cognitive function and just seeing where their mental state is at, and messing around with dopamine and whatnot, and arousal states or whatnot. But essentially that's kind of it. high velocities can actually really recover people, but people don't know that. But, for somebody that doesn't really have a good base, it might be kind of scary just sending somebody out, and sprinting for an hour and a half. Because it was even funny, even before Brett got out to Springfield. And one of the things when I retested some people before Brett showed up, and I really started thinking there was something more to this, is we were doing flying tens. And if on like Twitter and Speed People or whatever, everybody a lot of times talks about how like they did like 8 sprints, 9 sprints or whatever. And it was like every single group that I had, they're running flying tens for an hour and a half. And then they're like, hey, I got to go. Like my parents are here. And I'm like, you haven't dropped off. Like, what is going on here? And so that's a lot of it kind of really started making me question, like, we just did ISOs for 2 months. You're not even close to dropping off. You keep increasing your performance every single time, or just sitting, a PR over and over and over again, not even being tired. So that to me, it like kind of first blew my mind, but then it really realized that we haven't even tapped close to the potential that athletes can actually reach. And then that's, going back to what I originally said, then when you hear Jay Schroeder saying that he had athletes run, a 3.640, it starts to become a lot more believable.
Yeah. No, and that's awesome, man. And I love all the stuff that you've shared, and it's like not right or wrong for anyone, but it's a lot different than how I've practiced in the past, which has evolved immensely over the last 5 years doing it full time. But that's I fundamentally believe that there are 1,000 ways to skin a cat, and I'm on the quest of trying to figure out, well, if there's 1,000 ways, which one's the goddamn best? Because that's the one I want to find. And that's why, I started to expand the people I look into, the people I chat with. And I'd say you're certainly in a category of people that think differently than me or approach things a lot differently. And that's why I'm having these conversations, because I want to learn. I want to hear what you're testing out, and I want to see how that is. And I love all the stuff that you've shared here. I think there's a ton of like take homes for people. People can really understand the scope that you can have within the isometrics realm and how deep you can go. And you've given them tons of areas to focus on. As we wrap up here, there's one question that I kind of always ask people. Mm-hmm. And again, it's just in that vein of me trying to meet new people, connect with new people, and learn from them and hear what they're doing. So who are some people that I could try or should try and connect with that would, have some interesting conversations, interesting insights, and can share their message with other people and myself? Any people that come to mind for you?
Yeah. And I mean, I've already mentioned, so like the first person that really sparked my curiosity in just the sports performance realm was Brady Bomring, DAC Baseball. He has 2 accounts, DAC Baseball Fitness, whatever. But he's a great guy to reach out to. He's very smart. I'd say definitely underrated, or maybe not. Maybe he probably won't even like that I said that. But I'll say he's probably the most knowledgeable person when it comes to the baseball things, just because I think, we've worked together. We know that these kinds of things, we've explored with these things. So I don't know. I don't know if you know anything about baseball, but they're very behind. And I don't have a problem with saying this, which, is a big reason why I got into research even in the beginning place, because the stuff that baseball players do to train is just ridiculous. It's just not smart. And so that was a lot of it was like, my first research project was, and I even worked with Brady a little bit on this, and eventually trying to get it published, but was on the whole idea of how, are the exercises that we're actually doing mimicking competitive sports, and can we measure that? And that's something we did. And I can tell you, like, I have over 50,000 Excel sheets of exercises, things that what we think are actually plyometric or ballistic or fast paced movements, that the rate that they happen don't even happen that fast. And so that was all of that. So Brady for sure, because he's got some knowledge on that too. And then other guy, Dr. Mark Wetzel, chiropractor out in Nashville. He's a brilliant guy. He had some of the smartest mentors an individual could have. So he was just truly blessed to be able to work with that. So his knowledge of just breath work, the importance of breath, his knowledge of isometrics, and just training in general very well. And then I'd say that there's some other people, but there's certain people that like to stay under the radar,
Mm-hmm.
which I also encourage listeners to not necessarily always follow. This is just kind of a side note, but the people that you usually see who are on the mainstream or speaking the most on social media usually aren't the people who came up with information. I mean, nobody really is, but like the people that are like the most dangerous people are truly the ones you don't know about.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Because they're so busy doing it, right? Like they don't care to share. They just are obsessed with practicing it. They're just in the lab 24/7.
Sure. Yeah, you could definitely say that. And they just let other people kind of take their credit, but it's kind of funny sometimes. But figure out who, if there's somebody that's popular or whatever on social media, figure out who they learn from, and then go talk to that person rather than just the straight up person would be kind of my recommendation. Like figure out the source of who's everybody listening to. And that's what I did.
Yeah.
And, you trace, the tree far back enough and you quickly realize that everybody's getting everything from one person. And so, that's about that.
No, that's awesome.
So Brady and Dr. Mark.
I will definitely try and get in contact with them and see if they're open to it. So last thing here. So if people have questions for you, they want to connect with you or learn more about what you're doing, inquire about any of your services or whatever, where can people find you?
Yeah. Instagram is probably the easiest. You just send me a DM. Any questions you have.
What's your handle?
Train efficiently. Yeah.
I'll link it all in here as well.
Perfect. So yeah, you can just send me a DM if you have more questions or want to challenge something or whatnot. But I will say too, also with that as well, something that I do is, I started out where I was like, I'm going to do remote training. And what ended up happening was I ended up getting continuing education for coaches. So I was looking to train more athletes, but the last 4 months, I haven't really focused on athletes. I've had a couple athletes, but it's all been coaches that just want to learn more. So I have a continuing education for coaches that I put together. And essentially what it is it's you build the curriculum. So it's based upon your curiosity. So essentially you set the times that you want to learn. If you want to, learn 2 days a week, 5 days a week, I don't care. You just kind of build a plan, and there's no set structure. There's no hey, this is our PowerPoint. This is what we're going to learn about. It's no, you tell me what fascinates you, and then we'll let the rabbit hole go from there. So that's kind of how I treat it. So that's also something that people are interested in. They can reach out to me that way.
That's cool, man. Well, let's wrap it up here. Thank you so much for coming on, man. And I would love to keep in touch and learn more about what you're doing, and maybe do another one of these someday. Get Brett on here as well.
That'd be a lot of fun.
It would be. All right, man. Well, thank you.